It was a cold morning when Emily arrived for her shift at the dawn shelter. The air inside the shelter felt heavy, thick with the lingering chill of the early hours. She had always loved the stillness of the morning, how the world seemed to pause, as if holding its breath, just before the rush of the day began. But today there was something different, something unsettling in the way the shelter's director, John, was standing by the entrance, his usually calm face drawn tight with concern. "Emily," he said softly, his voice tinged with a worry she had never heard from him before. "We have a new case. A special one." Emily raised an eyebrow, intrigued but sensing the gravity in his tone. John rarely spoke like this. He was the kind of person who could face the darkest situations with a quiet strength. Whatever was happening today, it was different. "It's a dog," John continued, his voice shaky. "His name's Rex. He's in the basement in the farthest cage. I don't know what we're dealing with here." She followed him down the narrow, dimly lit hallway that led to the basement. The old wooden steps creaked under their weight, a reminder of the years the shelter had endured, trying to give a voice to the animals that came through its doors. The air grew colder as they descended, and Emily could smell the mustiness of the place, the dampness that clung to the walls. John stopped in front of a small, rusted door at the end of the hallway. He looked at Emily with a mixture of sadness and regret. "I don't know if we can help him, Emily. I've never seen a dog like this before. He's been locked in a cage for years. He won't eat, won't drink, just cowers in the corner." Emily felt a knot form in her stomach, but her resolve only grew stronger. "Let me see him," she said softly. John opened the door slowly, and Emily's heart sank when she saw Rex. He was a large Staffordshire Terrier, but his once muscular frame was now nothing more than skin and bones. His fur was matted and unkempt, a dull, lifeless shade of brown. His body trembled slightly as he sat in the farthest corner of the cage, eyes wide, his pupils dilated with fear. The room was dark, the only light filtering in from a small, grimy window high on the wall. Rex seemed to shrink further into the shadows, his body folding in on itself as if trying to disappear completely. His eyes, though those eyes haunted her. They were full of fear, fear so deep it seemed to penetrate his very soul. They flickered toward her for a moment before quickly darting away, closing at every sound, every movement. She could see that he was trying to protect himself from the world, from everything that had hurt him. "Rex," John whispered, his voice laced with sympathy. "He doesn't respond to anyone. He doesn't even react to food. It's like he's given up." Emily felt a deep, aching sadness fill her chest. She crouched down, her knees creaking under the weight of the cold, damp floor. Rex's eyes snapped to hers, and he recoiled, the fear in his body so palpable it made her heart break. "Why doesn't he trust anyone?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's been through hell," John replied quietly. "I don't think he knows what it's like to feel safe." Emily's throat tightened. She had seen animals in pain before, animals who had been abandoned or abused, but there was something in Rex's eyes that was different. It was the look of a soul that had been broken, a spirit that had been crushed by years of neglect and cruelty. "Let me try something," Emily said, her voice firm with a quiet determination. "I think I can help him." John looked at her, hesitant, unsure, but something in Emily's gaze convinced him. Maybe it was the calmness in her voice, the conviction that she could make a difference. "I'll stay here with him," Emily said. "I'll wait for as long as it takes." John nodded, though he still looked uncertain. "We'll keep an eye on you, Emily. But if he gets violent or—" "I'll be fine," she reassured him. As John left the basement, Emily remained in place, sitting on the cold floor, her back straight but relaxed. She didn't make any sudden moves. She didn't try to approach Rex. She simply waited, watching him from a distance, letting him take in her presence without feeling threatened. The room was eerily quiet, save for the soft, rhythmic sound of Rex's breathing. The minutes stretched into hours. Emily remained still, not moving a muscle, letting Rex adjust to her presence at his own pace. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew that trust wasn't something that could be rushed. As the hours passed, Emily began to notice the smallest of changes. Rex's trembling seemed to lessen slightly. His eyes, though still filled with fear, no longer darted away with every sound. His ears flickered now and then, lifting slightly at the slightest noise. Emily's heart swelled with hope. She stayed where she was, not pushing him, not trying to force anything. She understood now trust would take time. The morning light slowly faded as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long, soft shadows through the small window. Emily's body ached from the hours of sitting still, but she didn't move. She couldn't. There was something in her heart telling her that this was the right thing to do. That if she could just stay patient, if she could just wait, Rex might take the first step. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Rex lifted his head slightly, sniffing the air. Emily held her breath. Could it be? Was he starting to trust her? Her heart pounded in her chest as she gently pulled out a small piece of cooked chicken from her pocket, holding it out on the floor in front of her. She placed it carefully without making any sudden movements. She watched Rex's eyes, saw the hesitation in them, the wariness. But she remained still, waiting. Rex stared at the chicken for a long moment. He looked up at Emily, then back at the food. For the first time, his body seemed to soften just a little. Slowly, he shifted forward, his muscles trembling, unsure. Then, with a quick movement, he grabbed the chicken, snapping it up and retreating to the farthest corner of the cage. He didn't come any closer, but Emily didn't mind. This was a start. This was the first step toward healing. And it was all she needed. The days that followed felt like a delicate dance, a slow, almost imperceptible progression from fear to tentative curiosity. Emily was there every morning, sitting in the same spot on the cold basement floor, never forcing herself on Rex, never moving too quickly. She learned to read his small cues, the slight lift of his ears, the tiniest twitch of his tail, the way his body would freeze before taking even the smallest step. Each day, she would wait for him to make the first move, never pushing, never rushing. And slowly, ever so slowly, Rex began to trust her more. It was in the smallest of actions. A soft breath that didn't turn into a panicked gasp when she shifted her position. A momentary glance from him that lasted a fraction longer than before. The way he no longer shrank back in terror when she spoke in a low, soothing voice. There were setbacks, of course. Times when the fear would return, and Rex would retreat into the farthest corner of his cage, his trembling body shaking violently. Emily knew that fear was a ghost that would never fully leave him, not after the abuse he had endured. But each time it happened, Emily would stay. She would wait, her eyes never leaving his. She wouldn't force herself on him. She wouldn't speak loudly. She would just let him know she was there, not as a threat, but as a promise that things could be different. One morning, as she sat in front of his cage, she noticed something different. Rex was closer to the bars than usual, his eyes no longer wide with panic but more curious. She held her breath, afraid that even the smallest movement might startle him. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he looked at her with something new in his gaze, a soft, cautious recognition. Emily smiled softly, reaching out slowly, not toward him, but just close enough so he could see her open palm. Her hand was trembling, not from fear, but from hope. It was a fragile thing, this trust they were building, and she didn't want to break it. Rex's eyes flickered between her hand and her face, then back to her hand again. For the first time, he didn't pull back. He didn't retreat. He just watched. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "You don't have to come any closer," she whispered, her voice soft and steady. "But I'm here if you want to." It was a moment of pure silence. Time seemed to slow down, stretching infinitely in that small room. Then, Rex did something that made Emily's heart leap. He took a step toward her. It was hesitant, slow, each paw touching the floor like he was testing it for safety. But it was a step. One small step forward. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her chest tight with emotion. She held her ground, still and quiet, not daring to move a muscle. Rex's body tensed, But he didn't retreat. Instead, he lowered his head, sniffing the air just inches from her palm. Emily felt a tear slip down her cheek as she whispered, "It's okay, Rex. I won't hurt you." Rex sniffed again, then stepped back, retreating to the corner of the cage where he usually stayed. But this time he didn't cower. He just sat there watching her. It wasn't much, but to Emily it was everything. The days continued like this. Rex would inch closer, then pull back, as if trying to gauge whether he was safe. Emily was patient. She knew this was not something that could be rushed. Every small victory felt like a mountain climbed. And as each day passed, she could see the change in him. The way he no longer reacted with terror when she entered the room. The way he didn't shut his eyes at every little sound. One afternoon, as the sun streamed weakly through the basement window, Emily brought a small bowl of water into the room. Rex was sitting in the corner, his head tilted slightly, watching her. She placed the bowl just outside the bars of his cage. But this time, she didn't leave immediately. She sat down in front of him, her back straight, her hands resting on her knees. She spoke softly, as she always did. "It's okay, Rex. You can drink whenever you're ready." For a moment, nothing happened. Rex remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the bowl but not yet moving toward it. Emily waited, and then, with a tentative movement, Rex took a slow step forward, his eyes flickering toward her. His body was stiff with uncertainty, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he cautiously sniffed the water, then dipped his head down to lap at it. Emily's heart swelled with a quiet joy, her eyes soft with pride. It wasn't a grand gesture, but to her, it was a monumental one. Rex had chosen to trust her, even in this small, fragile way. That evening, Emily stayed longer than usual. She didn't want to leave Rex alone just yet, not when he had made such progress. She brought him some cooked chicken again, just like the first day, and gently placed a piece outside his cage. Rex looked at her for a long moment, as if considering whether or not to approach. Emily remained motionless, not speaking, not moving, just letting him decide. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Rex stepped forward again, this time with less hesitation. He took the food, his eyes flicking up to meet hers for a brief second before he retreated back to the corner of his cage. But this time, Emily didn't feel disappointment. She felt pride. He was getting there, slowly, surely. As the days turned into weeks, Emily continued her quiet vigil by Rex's cage. She would arrive early in the morning, long before the shelter began to bustle with activity, and stay until the last light of day had faded. The progress was slow, but it was there, unmistakable. Every tiny step Rex took toward healing was like a gift, a sign that perhaps, despite all he had endured, there was still hope. Rex's body, once so emaciated and fragile, had begun to gain a little weight. His coat, though still thin and ragged, had started to shine in places where his fur had once been dull and patchy. His movements were no longer as stiff, and though he still cowered at the slightest sound, he had begun to approach Emily more often. He would sit just outside the bars of his cage, watching her with wide, cautious eyes, always hesitant but curious. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it was no longer the dominating force in his life. It was during one of these quiet moments that something unexpected happened. Emily had brought in a bowl of food, and as she sat on the floor in front of his cage, she noticed Rex watching her with unusual intensity. His head was slightly tilted, his ears perked, and his eyes, though still fearful, held a trace of something more, something like longing. She placed the bowl carefully on the floor, just a few inches from the bars. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply let him decide whether he wanted to come closer. Rex watched the food for a long time, his body tense, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the faint sound of his breathing. And then, suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the shelter. A metal bowl clattered to the floor from somewhere upstairs, its sound sharp and jarring. It was a sound that shattered the fragile peace that had settled between them. Rex froze, his body stiff with terror. His eyes widened in panic, and without warning, he bolted backward, slamming into the back of his cage, his breath coming in frantic, shallow gasps. His muscles trembled violently, and he let out a low whine, his body shaking as if it were about to break apart. Emily's heart clenched with sympathy. She had seen this before, how quickly fear could take hold, how it could erase all the progress they had made in an instant. She stood up slowly, her heart racing, but she didn't approach him. She didn't want to push him further into panic. Instead, she crouched down again, her voice low and soothing. "Rex," she whispered, her voice barely a murmur. "It's okay, Rex. You're safe. It's just a noise. Nothing's going to hurt you." Rex's eyes flicked toward her, his body still trembling. His pupils were dilated with fear, and his mouth hung open as he panted, but he didn't retreat any further. Emily stayed where she was, waiting for the storm of panic to subside. She didn't move, didn't try to get closer. She simply spoke in the same gentle tone, repeating the words she had said to him countless times before. "Sure, it's okay. You're okay." For what felt like an eternity, Rex remained frozen in place, his eyes locked on her but not yet able to fully comprehend her presence as a source of safety. Emily's throat tightened, but she didn't look away. She knew that trust, once shattered, couldn't be rebuilt with force or desperation. It would only happen with time. So she waited, and slowly, very slowly, Rex began to calm down. His body was still tense, but the frantic trembling started to lessen. His breath evened out, though he still remained on edge. Emily's voice was soft, steady, as she continued to reassure him. "Take your time, Rex. You're okay." The minutes passed, stretching into what felt like an hour. Slowly, Rex's posture began to soften. He lowered his head slightly, his ears flicking back just a little. His breathing began to steady, though he still kept his distance. Emily stayed as still as possible, her eyes never leaving his, giving him the space he needed to come back to her, to come back to the safety she had promised him. Eventually, after what felt like the longest pause in time, Rex took a small step forward. His body was still cautious, his movements jerky, but it was a step. He sniffed the air again, then glanced at the bowl of food, which still sat untouched on the floor between them. Emily's heart soared with quiet relief. She didn't reach for the food. She didn't try to coax him closer. She simply allowed him to decide. After a moment, Rex took another step forward. His nose twitched as he inhaled deeply, and then, with a hesitant, slow movement, he dipped his head toward the bowl and took a tentative bite. Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she watched him eat, his trembling body now still. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of fear, moments of setback. But there was progress, and that was enough for her. As the days passed, Rex began to recover from the trauma of that moment. Emily stayed by his side, patient as always, never pushing him, never forcing him. She continued to offer him food, water, and love, and each day, Rex responded a little more. And then, one afternoon, it happened. Rex had been sitting near the bars of his cage, as he often did, watching Emily with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She had been speaking to him softly, as she always did, when something shifted. Rex took a deep breath, his body tensing for just a moment, and then, with slow, deliberate movements, he stood up. His eyes locked on hers, and for the first time, there was something in them, something like trust. He took a step forward, then another, and another. Before Emily could even process what was happening, Rex was standing just outside the bars of his cage, his head slightly lowered but his body no longer trembling. His eyes were still wary, but they no longer held that same deep, paralyzing fear. Instead, they held something new, a cautious hope. Emily didn't move. She just stayed where she was, her breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering in her chest. Rex paused for a moment, as if unsure, but then, as if deciding that it was safe, he stepped closer. He touched her hand with his nose. The world seemed to stop. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and tears welled in her eyes as she slowly, gently, placed her hand on his head. Rex didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into her touch, his body relaxing as he allowed her to pet him for the first time. She held back tears, her heart overflowing with emotion. It was a breakthrough, the first true sign that Rex was beginning to trust her, to understand that not all humans were like the ones who had hurt him. And for the first time, Emily felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, Rex was finally beginning to heal. The days that followed Rex's breakthrough were some of the most emotionally charged of Emily's life. Each small victory felt monumental. Each quiet moment shared between them was a testament to the trust they were slowly building. But it was far from easy. There were still days when fear would take over, when Rex would retreat into the farthest corner of his cage and refuse to acknowledge her presence. It was a constant back and forth, a delicate balance between progress and setbacks. But Emily had come to understand that this was part of the process. She knew that healing didn't happen in a straight line. It was a winding road, full of twists and turns. Emily continued her routine of sitting quietly in front of Rex's cage, offering him food, water, and her presence. She had learned not to pressure him, to let him come to her on his own terms. Sometimes he would move closer, other times he would retreat. But the important thing was that he was moving forward, however slowly. One chilly afternoon, Emily arrived at the shelter to find Rex sitting near the door of his cage, his eyes fixed on her. For a moment, she wondered if it was just another fleeting moment of curiosity, a passing interest. But something in the way he looked at her made her pause. His body was relaxed. There was no tension, no fear. It was as though he was waiting for something. "Hey, Rex," Emily said softly, her voice gentle and calm. "You doing okay today?" Rex didn't flinch at the sound of her voice, didn't shrink back in terror. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. She smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She could see the changes in him now, the way he no longer immediately reacted with panic at every sound or movement. She sat down on the floor as she always did, just a few feet from his cage. She didn't try to get closer, didn't try to coax him forward. She just let him be, letting him come to her when he was ready. She had learned that the key to reaching him was patience. Not rushing, not forcing, but allowing him the time and space he needed to feel safe. For several long moments, Rex just sat there, his eyes still fixed on her. Then, without warning, he stood up, his body moving with more confidence than it ever had before. Emily's heart raced, her breath catching in her throat as she watched him approach the bars of his cage. He was closer now than he had ever been before, and for the first time, his movements weren't tentative. They weren't filled with fear. Slowly, Rex reached out, his nose touching the bars of the cage, just inches from Emily's hand. She held her breath, unsure of what to do. But before she could even decide, Rex pushed forward, his nose gently brushing against her fingers. It was a simple touch, just a light, fleeting contact, but to Emily, it felt like everything. The bond they had been building, so fragile and uncertain, had shifted once again. It was the first time he had initiated the contact, the first time he had come to her without hesitation. She gently placed her hand on the bars of the cage, and for a moment, they stood there together, separated only by the metal between them. That evening, Emily sat with him for hours, offering him food and water, allowing him to come closer when he was ready, but never rushing. By the time her shift ended, Rex had settled into a corner of his cage, his eyes still watching her, but his body relaxed. He no longer trembled at every sound, no longer flinched at her movements. It was a quiet moment, but one that felt like a victory. The next few days were filled with similar moments. Rex would come closer to the bars of his cage, sometimes touching her hand, sometimes just watching her silently. He was still cautious, still uncertain, but the fear that had once controlled him was no longer the driving force in his life. Slowly, very slowly, he was beginning to trust. But it wasn't just Rex who was changing. Emily found herself falling more and more in love with the quiet, steadfast dog who had been through so much. His strength, though hidden beneath layers of trauma, was there, faint but undeniable. She saw it in the way he would lift his head and look around when she entered the room, in the way his body would relax when she spoke to him, as if he had finally begun to believe that safety was possible. One afternoon, after several weeks of patient work, Emily sat in front of Rex's cage as usual. But today something felt different. Rex was sitting closer than ever before, his body calm, his eyes focused on her. He had made so much progress. She could see it in the way he carried himself, in the way he no longer shrank back from the world around him. It was still a fragile progress, but it was real. Emily smiled at him, her heart full of pride. "You're doing so well, Rex," she whispered. And then, for the first time in weeks, something happened that Emily had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. Rex took a step forward. It wasn't a giant leap, but it was enough. He moved closer to her, his body relaxed, his tail giving a tiny, hesitant wag. And then, with a soft whine, he did something that almost made Emily cry. He pushed his nose through the bars of his cage and nudged her hand. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. She could hardly believe it. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when Rex, the dog who had been so broken, so terrified of everything, finally decided to trust her completely. Tears welled up in her eyes as she gently stroked his head through the bars. "It's okay, Rex," she whispered. "You're safe now. I'll always be here." And in that moment, she knew, deep in her heart, that Rex had finally found a home in her heart. He had finally found the safety and love he so desperately needed. The road ahead would still be long, but for the first time, it felt like the beginning of something beautiful. The weeks that followed Rex's breakthrough were a turning point for both him and Emily. Rex had started to emerge from the shadows of his trauma, and though the journey was far from over, the bond between them had deepened beyond anything Emily had expected. She had always known that rescue was not just about healing the body, it was about healing the heart. And Rex's heart, though scarred and bruised, was beginning to trust again. Each day, Emily spent more time with him. She would sit for hours in front of his cage, speaking softly to him, offering him food, and sometimes simply being there without expectation. She never rushed him. Every little step he took toward healing, every small sign that he was willing to come closer to her, felt like a miracle. She watched, day by day, as Rex's eyes softened, the fearful flicker replaced by curiosity, and sometimes even affection. It was a rainy afternoon when the next big breakthrough happened. Emily had arrived at the shelter early, her boots still wet from the storm outside. The smell of damp earth and fresh rain clung to her jacket, but her focus was entirely on Rex. She had noticed that in the mornings, he was more alert, more willing to watch her with less fear and more engagement. His recovery had been slow, but in the quiet moments, she could see the change. He no longer hid when she entered the room. His body no longer trembled, and when he looked at her, his eyes didn't just hold fear. They held something else, something that felt like hope. Emily sat down on the cold floor, just a few feet from his cage. She noticed that Rex was already sitting near the bars, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that felt different from before. There was no panic in his gaze now. He had become more comfortable in her presence, more confident in the safety she provided. "Hi, Rex," she whispered, smiling at him. "You doing all right today?" For a moment, Rex didn't move. He simply sat there, his eyes locked on hers. But then, to Emily's surprise, he stood up. Slowly, deliberately, he took one step forward, then another. His tail, which had been so still in the past, gave the faintest of wags. Emily held her breath, her heart racing. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when Rex would choose to step beyond the cage, beyond the fear, and trust her fully. Without thinking, she held her hand out toward him, palm open, her voice steady and calm. "Come here, Rex. You're safe. I'm right here." Rex hesitated for only a moment before he took another step forward. His eyes never left hers, and his body, though still tense, was moving with more purpose now. Emily's hand was trembling as she held it out, and as he reached the bars of his cage, he stopped, his nose brushing against her fingers. It was the closest he had ever been, and for a moment, Emily thought her heart might burst from the intensity of the moment. He had taken the final step. He had reached out to her, not out of fear or necessity, but because he was ready to trust. He was ready to connect. With a soft exhale, Emily gently slid her hand through the bars of the cage, and for the first time, Rex leaned into her touch. His body relaxed as her fingers gently brushed his fur, and he made a soft, contented sound, something between a sigh and a soft whine. Emily couldn't stop the tears from welling in her eyes. She had been with him for so long, watching him struggle, trying to find a way to help him heal. But in this moment, she knew that he was healing. Slowly, piece by piece, he was letting go of the fear that had held him captive for so long. For the next few days, Rex continued to make strides. He came closer to her each time, sometimes even sitting next to the bars of his cage with his body relaxed, his eyes calm. But Emily didn't want to rush him. She knew that full trust, the kind that allowed a dog like Rex to finally let go of his past, would take time. And so, she waited. The shelter staff watched in awe as Rex blossomed under Emily's care. He still had moments of fear, still recoiled at loud sounds or sudden movements, but each time, Emily was there. She was a steady, constant presence in his life, and Rex began to see her as someone he could trust, someone who would protect him from the horrors of his past. And then, one afternoon, something extraordinary happened. It was just after lunch, and Emily had been sitting in front of Rex's cage as usual. She had brought in some food for him, but this time, she noticed that he wasn't just sitting near the bars watching her. He was standing in front of the cage, his body slightly tense but his eyes calm, almost expectant. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. And then, without warning, Rex took a step back from the cage door and, with a soft grunt, pushed it open. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had never seen him do this before. Rex had never made a move to open the cage door, and while she had always hoped for this moment, she had never dared to expect it so soon. Rex hesitated for a moment, looking back at Emily as if checking that it was okay. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and she smiled softly. "It's okay, Rex," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You can come out." With that, Rex took a tentative step out of his cage. His paws clicked softly on the floor as he moved closer to Emily, his eyes wide but steady. He stopped just in front of her, his body still tense but no longer trembling with fear. Emily slowly extended her hand toward him, her fingers outstretched but not pushing. She wanted him to come to her on his own. For a long moment, Rex just stood there, his head slightly lowered, his tail moving in small, uncertain wags. And then, as if making a decision, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He stopped just in front of her, his nose gently nudging her hand. Tears sprang to Emily's eyes as she gently ran her fingers through his fur. "Good boy, Rex," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." In that moment, she knew that Rex had finally left the past behind. He had stepped out of his cage. Not just physically, but emotionally. He had trusted her enough to take that final step, to come into the world and into her life completely. And as she sat there, with Rex standing before her, his head resting gently in her lap, Emily knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but together, they would face them. Because now, Rex had a family, he had her, and he was finally truly home.